Shabbat Shalom. Let's start with a melody. Yai da 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 da, yai da 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 da, yai da 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 da, yai da 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 again, yai da 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 da, yai 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 da ya da 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 da, yai da 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 da, yai da ya da 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 da, yai da 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 da, yai da 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 da. Yai die 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 die, yai die 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 die, yai die ya da 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 da, yai die 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 die, yai die ya da 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 da, die 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 die, ya da da da, yai die 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 die, ya da 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 die die, ya da 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 die 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 die. We can fancy it up a little bit. Yai die 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 die. Yai die 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 die, yai die 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 die, yai die ya da 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 da, yai die 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 die, ya da 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 die die, ya da 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 die, yai die 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 die, ya da 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 die, yai die 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 die, ya da 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 die die, ya da 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 die, die die die, yai die 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 die, yai da ya da 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 da, yai da 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 da, yai da ya da 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 da, yai da 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 da. Good Shabbos, thanks for joining in, and perhaps you have a talis, and if so, I invite you to say the bracha lahit teif b'tzitzit with me. Excuse me. Pardon me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvot v'tzivanu l'teif b'tzitzit. Beginning this morning with a bracha that we haven't recited in a while. We're on page 99. There's an intensity about this blessing, an intensity, but also an intimacy and a comfort. It's the first bracha on page 99, and it is speaking of the soul, which is gifted to each and every one of us every single day, not just on Shabbos, but every single day of our lives. And there's a little bit of Hebrew and English. We'll start on the Hebrew side and then shift to the English side on page 99. Elohai neshama shenatata bi tohorahi. My God, the soul that you've given me is pure. You created it. You formed it. You breathed it into me. You watch over it when it is in me. In the future, you will take it from me, but then restore it to me in the world that is coming. As long as this soul is within me, I thank you, Adonai, my God, God of my ancestors, ruler of all creation, master of all souls, Baruch atah Adonai, who restores the soul to the lifeless form. Upon awakening, you and I have a new opportunity before us. It's not just a matter of awakening and getting out of bed and washing and getting dressed and eating and starting a day. It's a matter of taking stock of what it means to have a soul, the breath of God. And you and I, each one of us, is a vessel of the breath of God. How will you and I walk out into the world on this day or on a Tuesday or on any day of the week or the month or the year without taking stock, without appreciating what it means to be a vessel containing the breath of God? Surely that will change how you and I interact with each other and the world itself for the better. We should see ourselves as a source of inspiration. We should see ourselves as a means of carrying forth sanctity into the world, bringing physical reality in a message. We're emissaries of sanctity into the physical world. Wow. Now I'm ready for Birchot HaShachar. The early morning blessings, we rise on page 103 and 104. Pardon me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lasech v'ivina lavchin ben yom uvein laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam sha'asani b'tzalmo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam sha'asani ben chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam sha'asani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam pokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam malbish arumim. And the top of 104. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam zokef kifufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam rokah haaretz al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamechin mitzadei gaver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam sha'asa li kol tzarki. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam ozer Yisrael bigvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam oter Yisrael b'tif'ara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hanoten lo'of koach. Today and every day, may you look upon us, and may all who see us look upon us with eyes filled with kindness, love, and compassion. Act toward us with kindly love. Baruch atah Adonai, who acts with kindly love to the people Israel. Baruch Adonai Yisrael. On page 106. Looking down on page 106, about 9 lines down, you see, Hear, O Israel, Shema Yisrael. This is not the Shema that you and I are familiar with. It's a quotation. It's kind of like having a bumper sticker on our cars. This little bumper sticker here on page 106 is a reminder that we're the people who say the Shema Yisrael twice a day. We say the Shema in the morning service, and we say the Shema every day in the evening service. So this is a bumper sticker, and it's quoting, by the way, we're the ones who say the Shema. And associated with that is a sense of happiness, and I think a little bit of satisfaction. The words are, Ashreinu matov chelkenu, umanaim goralenu. Ashrenu, Ashrenu, matov chelkenu, umanaim, umanaim, umanaim goralenu. Ashrenu, Ashrenu, matov chelkenu, umanaim, umanaim, umanaim goralenu. Ashrenu, Ashrenu, matov chelkenu, umanaim, umanaim, umanaim goralenu. Yadai da da da, yadai da da da, yadai da 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 da, yadai da da da, yadai da da da, yadai da 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 da, yadai da da da, yadai da da da, yadai da 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 da, yadai da da da, yadai da da da, yadai da 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 da. It's a bumper sticker. Let's wake up aware of words that are about to come forth in just a few moments. And now, the Psalm for Shabbat on page 112. Mizmor shir liyom haShabbat, tov lehodot l'Adonai, ulezamer l'shimcha elyon, ulezamer l'shimcha elyon, lahagid baboker chasdecha, ve'emunatcha balelot, alei asor v'alei navel, alei higayon bechinot. Mizmor shir liyom haShabbat, tov lehodot l'Adonai, ulezamer l'shimcha elyon, ulezamer l'shimcha elyon. Ki simachtani roi b'folecha, b'maaseh yodecha aranen, ma'galu ma'asecha Adonai mod, amku machshavotecha. Mizmor shir liyom haShabbat, tov lehodot l'Adonai, ulezamer l'shimcha elyon, ulezamer l'shimcha elyon. A moment of silence. Tzadik katamar yifrach, kerez balbanon yizkeh, shetulim bebeit Adonai, bechatrot Eloheinu yafrichu, od yenovon beseva, deshenim verananim yeyo lehagid, ki ashar Adonai tzuri v'lo avlatabo. Baruch Shamar, officially opening the morning service on page 122. Baruch Shamar v'haya ha'olam, Baruch hu, Baruch oseh v'reshit, Baruch omer ve'oseh, Baruch gozer u'mekayim, Baruch merachem al haaretz, Baruch merachem al habriot, Baruch mishalem sachar tov lireov, Baruch chaylod v'kayom lo netzach, Baruch podeh u'matzil, Baruch Shemo. The singular one who gives life to the world, the sovereign who is praised and glorified forever and ever. This is your great name. Baruch atah Adonai, sovereign, celebrated with songs of praise. Yochid cheho lamim melech mishbachu mufawar adeyat shemo hagadol. Baruch atah Adonai melech muhal batish bachot. The main idea of the Baruch Shamar is to get ready to start singing through the rest of the service, the Ashrei and the Hallelujah. The main idea of the Baruch Shamar is to get ready to start singing, to prepare for the Baruch Hu and the Shema and the Amid and the Torah service. The main idea of the Baruch Shamar is to get ready to start singing. But the introduction to the Baruch Shamar holds a different message. It's very simple Hebrew. It's Baruch, 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 blessed is the one. And it speaks of creation. It speaks of God's role in Mirachem al briot, caring for people and animals. Meshalem sachar, making sure that goodness comes into the world. And podem matzil, caring for people. But against the backdrop of this little opening stanza, which speaks of caring for people and animals and bringing goodness into the world, is a phrase that calls out to me. Mirachem al haaretz, God is compassionate over the world itself. And we are commanded to be in the image of God. We are commanded to imitate God in behavior. So if God is compassionate upon the world, then we are to be compassionate upon the world as well. In the preliminary Baruch Shamar, which leads us up to the main idea of singing to get ready to be aware of who we are, we're reminded to care for the world. Climate change is not only an issue to be decided upon by delegates to the United Nations and conventions and meetings and conferences between diplomats and CEOs. Each and every day, in order to get ready to sing, we have to take stock of and be caring for and compassionate of the world. Before we sing, we have to care for the world. Ashrei is on page 136. Ashrei yoshvei beitecha od yalucha sela Ashreiham shekachalo Ashreiham sharonoi Elohov Tehillah leDavid Aramimcha Elohai HaMelech Vavarcha Shimcha Leolam Voed B'chol Yom Avarcheka Va'ahalala Shimcha Leolam Voed Gadol Adonai Mulol Maod V'lig Dulato Ein Cheker Dolador Yishabach Masecha Ugvurotecha Yagidu Hadar Kavod Hodecha V'divrei Niflotecha Asicha Ve'ezuz Nortecha Yomeru Ugdulatecha Asapreno Zecherav Tuvecha Yabiu V'tzid Katecha Yeranenu Chanun Rachum Adonai Erech Alpaim Ugdol Chesed Tov Adonai Lakol Rachamov Al Kol Ma'asav Yoduch Adonai Kol Ma'asecha V'chasidecha Yevarchucha Kavod Malchutcha Yomeru Ugvoratcha Yedaberu Lodia Livnei Hadam Gvorotav Uchavod Hadar Malchuto Malchutcha Malchut Kol Olamim Umemshaltecha B'chol Dor V'dor Somech Aren L'chol Hanoflim V'zokef L'chol Hakfufim Einei Chol Elecha Yesaberu V'ata Noten Lehem Et Ochlam B'ito Poteach Et Yodecha Umaspia L'chol Chayratzon Tzadik Adonai B'chol Drachov V'chasid B'chol Ma'asav Karov Adonai L'chol Korov L'chol Asher Yikra'u V'emet Ritzon Yireav Ya'aseh V'et Shavatam Yishma V'yoshiem Shomer Adonai Et Kol Ohavav V'et Kol Harshaim Yashmid Tilat Adonai Daber Pi V'varech Kol Basar Shem Gachal Olam Voed V'anachnu Nevarech Yah Me'atav Yad Olam Hallelujah. On page 141. Ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la 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 ya la hallelujah, hallelujah, il bekodsho, hallelujah, hallelujah, bekia uzo, hallelujah, 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 vig vorotav, hallelujah, hallelujah, karov gulo, hallelujah, 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 b'cheka shofar, hallelujah, hallelujah, b'nevel v'chinor, hallelujah, 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 b'tov umachol, hallelujah, hallelujah, b'minim ve'ugav, hallelujah, 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 v'tzil tzlei shama, hallelujah, hallelujah, v'tzil tzlei trua, kol anshama tehalelia, kol anshama tehalelia, kol anshama tehalelia, hallelujah, kol anshama tehalelia, hallelujah, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la 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 la, ya la la la. And now on page 142 in the Siddur, it's the third stanza down. It's one sentence. You, Adonai, are God. It was you who chose Abram, took him out of Ur of the Chaldees, changed his name to Abraham, and found him faithful. And this one sentence, which comes out of the Bible, comes into the Siddur here. It's a reminder that God touched your great-grandfather, your great-grandmother, your ancestors. And there's something of God's touch in the name that your ancestors wear. There's something of God's touch in your own name. How often do you stop and think about your name as being reflective of the touch of God? It's not just a word that you bring forth from your lips or a scratch of ink on a piece of paper. Part of your own identity, which is unique specifically to you, is the breath of God. Page 145, the breath of God. Nishmat kol chai tevarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu. And we respond by saying, Nishmat, the soul, breath of every living thing, blesses God's name. So just as God has touched us with God's own breath in our own names, our own identities, so do we respond with our own breath, reaching out to touch the name of God. Page 147, the bottom red arrow. Shekein chovat kol yitzrim lefanecha Adonai Eloheinu b'lei avoteinu v'imotenu lehodot lehalel leshabeach lefaer leromeim lehader levarech laleu lekalis Al kol divrei shira v'tishbechot David ben Yishai Avdecha mishichecho. The top of 148. Yishtabach Shimcha Lo'ad Malkeinu Ha'el HaMelech HaGadol VaHaKadosh B'Shamayim u'Ba'aretz Ki Lecha Na'eh Adonai Eloheinu V'lei Avoteinu V'imotenu Shir ushvacha halel v'zimra ozu memshala netzach gidula ugvura tehila v'tiferet kidusha u'malchut brachot vorot me'ata v'yad olam Baruch atah Adonai El melech gadol v'tishvachot El ha'odot Adonai niflot Habocher b'shirei zimra Melech elchei olamim Melech elchei olamim, God sovereign of the life of olamim, literally the universes. I don't know when this prayer specifically was written, perhaps 1800 years ago, and I don't know if they knew anything about multiverse or string theory, but it's great poetry. God is the sovereign of all the universes and beyond. We rise the early morning blessing on page 150, Birkat HaOr. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam yotzer uborei choshech oseh shalom uborei et hakol. Baruch atah Adonai, our God, sovereign of time and space, forming light and creating darkness, bringing harmony while creating all. On the English side in the left corner, it is not you alone, or we, or those others who pray. All things pray. All things pour forth their souls. The heavens pray. The earth prays. Every creature and every living thing prays. In all life there is longing. Creation is itself but a longing, a kind of prayer of the Almighty. We're seated. Page 151. Ya da 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 da, ya da da da, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da, ya da da da, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da, ya da 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 da. El Adon Akol Hamasim Baruch Baruch B'Fikol Nishama Gadol V'tuva Omalei Olam Da'at Utvuna Sovavim Oto Hamid Gai Al Chayot HaKodesh V'nera B'chavod Al Merkava Zachot Mishor Livnei Chiso Chesed V'rachamim Livnei Chavodo Tovim Ma'orot Shabara Eloheinu Yitzaram B'dat B'vina Olaskel Koach Ugvura Hanatan Bahem Liot Moshnim B'kerev Tevel Mleim Zviv Umfikim Noga Noeziv Amachalolam Smechim B'tzeitam V'sasim B'voam Osim B'yem Aritzon Konam Pe'er V'chavod Notnim Lishmo Tzahal Avarina Lezecher Malchuto Kora L'Shemesh V'yizrach Ora V'heit Kein Surat Havana Shem Shevach nonim lo kol tzava maram Tiveretu gedula serafim Yovanim v'chayot hakodesh Yada da 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 Yada da 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 Yada da 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 Yada da 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 Yada da 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 Yada da 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 Yada da 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 Yada da 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 Yada da 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 da. Every element of creation is something to be joyous over. I'm not sure about mosquitoes, but other than that, every element of creation is something to be joyous over. And that's what the Eladon is all about. And that's the preparation for the Shema on page 154, the first stanza on the English side. You have loved us deeply, Adonai our God, and showered us with boundless compassion. Avinu Malkeinu, for the sake of our ancestors who trusted in you and to whom you taught the laws of life, so may you be gracious to us and instruct us. Kind Creator, have compassion for us. Open our hearts so that we may understand, and with love discern, hear, and study. Observe, perform, and fulfill all the teachings of your Torah with love. Enlighten our eyes with your Torah. Attach our hearts to your mitzvot. Unify our hearts to love and revere your name, so that we never lose hope. As we trust in your great, holy, awe-inspiring name, we will delight and rejoice in your deliverance. We gather the four corners, and we hold these four corners together. And we realize that each one of us is essential, because if one individual is not holding the four corners together, then a corner has been dropped. Who's left out because I've dropped the corner? Representing the four corners of the world, Jews everywhere. Who's left out when I drop a corner? I can't allow a Jewish person to be left out because I drop a corner. Nobody can afford that. The bottom of page 154. V'avi'enu l'shalom me'arba kanfot haaretz v'tulichenu komemiyot le'artzenu Ki el poel Yeshuot ata Uvanu v'acharta mikolam v'lashon v'keraftanu l'shimcha hagadol Selah be'emet l'hodot l'cha Ol yachercha ba'ahava Baruch atah Adonai Habocher b'mo Yisrael be'ahava. Page 155. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Ve'ahavto et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha v'hayo hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam b'shivtecha b'veitecha U'v'lechtecha v'aderech u'v'shachbecha u'v'kumecha u'kishartam la'ot al yadecha והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. The third paragraph of the Shema, the middle of page 156. Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Yisrael, v'marta lehem, v'yasu lahem tzitzit, al kanfei vigdeihem ledorotam, v'natnu al tzitzit, hakanaf petil techelet, v'yalachem letzitzit, uritem oto, uschartem et kol mitzvot Adonai, v'asitem otam, v'lo taturo, acharei levavchem, v'acharei einechem, asher atem zonim achareihem, l'man tizkaru, v'asitem et kol mitzvotai, v'item kedoshim le'elohechem, Ani Adonai Elohechem, Asher Tzeitti Etchem Eretz Mitzrayim, Liot Lachem Le'Elohim, Ani Adonai Elohechem, Adonai Elohechem Emet. Most of us know the word Adonai. That's God's name. Elohim is the word God. So Adonai, Elohim, God is God. Adonai is God's name. Elohim is, you might say, the noun, God. Elohechem means y'all's God. And Elohechem is all over this page. Elohechem teaches that all of you have something in common. God is what unites all of you with all the differences that every one of us possesses. What holds us together is that we in some way are connected through God, a shared understanding of grandeur and holiness and transcendence. Even though every one of us thinks of God differently, we all share God together. And that's the conclusion of the Shema. Adonai, God, Elohechem, y'all's God. Emet is that source, that foundation for us. And now the Michamocha on page 158. Michamocha boilim Adonai, Mi kamocha nedar b'kodesh noratilot osefele shira chadasha shivchu geulim l'shimcha al sefat hayam yachad kulam hodu v'himlichu v'amro Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed tzur Yisrael kuma be'ezrat Yisrael ufadechinu mecha Yehuda v'Yisrael go aleinu Adonai tzivot shemo Kedosh Yisrael. Baruch Adonai Yisrael. We rise the Amida, beginning aloud on page 159 and 160, and thereafter a few moments of silence. Just a reminder, it's not fully silent. We begin with a whisper, an audible whisper. The first line is an audible whisper. And then 159 and 160 is aloud. And then thereafter 161 to 166, or whichever prayer you choose to focus on, is in silence. So there's an audible whisper, and I can hear your whisper. And you can hear my whisper, but it's a whisper nonetheless. And then it's full voice, and then it's silence. And the modulation of our sounds can reflect something that's going on inside us, and also encourage us to articulate with intensity a variety of levels. 3 small steps backward, practice it twice. Adonai, Sifatai, Tiftach. Forward, Ufi, Yagid, Tilatecha. You're getting the hang of it once more. Adonai, Sifatai, Tiftach. Ufi, Yagid, Tilatecha. Now we're ready. Adonai, Sifatai, Tiftach. Ufi, Yagid, Tilatecha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel Elohei Leah Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanora El Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim V'Konei HaKol V'Zocher Chastei Avot v'Imahot Umevi Goel Livnei V'Nehem L'man Shmo B'Ahava Melech Ozer Uvoked U'Moshiach U'Magen Baruch atah Adonai Magen Avraham Uvoked Sarah Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai Mechaye Meitim Atah Rav Lahoshia Mashiv Haruach Umarit Haga Hashem Mechalkel Chayim Bechesed Mechaye Meitim Berachamim Rabim Somech Noflim Verofech Cholim Omatir Asurim Omekayem Emunato Lishenei Afar Michamocha Baal Gevurot Omedal Melach Melech Meimit Omechaye Omatmiach Yeshua V'ne'eman Atah Lachayot Meitim Baruch atah Adonai Mechaye HaMeitim. Before we rise to take out the Torah, just a thought. We Jews have been praying for a long time. We've had this book for 2,000 or more years. But before this book came into being, we had Torah. And it seems, to our best guess, that what we call a synagogue came into being somewhere between 2,300 and 2,400 years ago, when from the Jewish point of view of the day, prophecy still existed. Malachi is the last prophet. Here in the Deep South, we call him Malachi. He's in the 400s. And probably around the time of Malachi, we start beginning to see the emergence of what we now call a synagogue, perhaps, give or take, or just after Malachi. And so as Malachi and his influence is beginning to wane, there's a need for something else, because as prophecy ends, we need to hear something. But if the man in the robes is no longer there to say, I represent God, what do we do? And so we begin to open Torah. And over a span of perhaps 100 years, that's when we have the development of what you and I now call the Torah reading, between 2,400 and 2,300 years ago. So people brought a Torah out in a place. It may have been a building, may have been just an open field, to read together. Jews don't read by themselves. Jews read together. And they began to read and study and learn together. And that led to what you and I call the Torah service. And that became formalized by 2,300 years ago. And ever since, we've been reading Torah. And then shortly after that, somebody very creative began to come up with the idea of what you and I call spoken prayer. And a prayer came forth before the Torah. And a prayer came forth gradually after the Torah. And then perhaps another prayer. And then perhaps another prayer. And my understanding is that at a certain point, different groupings of people, you might call them nuclei of teachers, began to fashion certain prayers, and they became attached to the front end of the Torah reading or the back end of the Torah reading. And as centuries passed, more and more prayers kind of grew and accumulated. And I picture a horizontal kosher Dagwood sandwich with the Torah in the middle and layers accumulating side to side to side. And then eventually it began to be written down, and then eventually it began to be printed. And that's what this is. So we just finished our private prayer, and now we're about to embark on Torah study, and we share our words with ourselves, each other, but we're also hearing the echoes of our ancestors through learning. I want us to be sensitive to what it means to having been in silent prayer and now opening our mouths and our ears and our minds to the words of God through Torah and the words of our ancestors through those layers of centuries of millennia. We rise, page 168, Vayhi bin Soah. Vayhi bin Soah ha'aron, vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai, ve'afutzu oyevecha, ve'yanusu misanecha, mipanecha, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, ki mitzion tetzei Torah, udavar Adonai mirushalayim. Baruch Shenatan Torah Torah. Baruch Shenatan Torah Torah. La'amo Yisrael B'kedushato.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo.
Echad Eloheinu, Gadol Adonenu, Kadosh Shemo. Gadol Adonai Tin Ramama Shmo Yachdav. Cha Adonai Agadola V'Agavora V'Tiferet V'Hanetzach V'Hahod Kichol B'Shamayim U'Va'aretz Kichol B'Shamayim U'Va'aretz L'cha Adonai Hamamlacha V'Amin Aseh L'chol Rosh Romemo Adonai Eloheinu Ve'ishtachavo Laharam Raglav Kadosh Hu Romemo Adonai Eloheinu Ve'ishtachavo Lehar Kodsho Kikadosh Adonai Eloheinu. We are seated. Shkoyach Adiel, Toda Rabbah. Every parsha, every Torah reading has a name. And the name is usually the first word or the first two words of the section for the week. And since we're going into a little bit of background for the Torah, just a reminder that when Torah is finalized and edited 2,500 or so years ago, there's an understanding, there's an awareness of where chunk 1 begins and ends, and where chunk 2 begins and ends, and chunk 3 begins and ends, and so forth. There are 54 chunks, or 54 Torah readings, and of course this is many centuries before anybody comes up with the idea of a chapter and a verse. There's no numbering here. There's no numbering of any type within the scroll. Of course, it's just straight letters, no vowels, no punctuation, no numbering. And then once we start creating codices or books, which are not Torah, eventually those chunks are indicated by a space or a gap in the books, but there's still no chapter numbers and still no verse numbers. That doesn't happen until much, much later. Chapter and verse numbering happens in the 1300s CE. So we're talking about our self-awareness of where each Torah reading begins and ends for a good 1,000 years before chapter and verse is incorporated into what you and I call modern books. So we just know where the Torah reading begins and where it ends, and Q, you might say, or a little red light or green light is the first word. So this week's parsha is Vayetze, and it corresponds to a number of chapters. We're reading a little bit later. We're in the end of Vayetze, so the reading that we shall be sharing and touching on for a little bit is found here on page 181. If you have a Tanakh at home and you're not reading in the Chumash, Tanakh, it's Genesis chapter number 31. In our Chumash, it's page 181, verse number 17. And just a little bit of background. You remember that in last week's Torah reading, we have old man Isaac. And old man Isaac is preparing to die. And as part of the tradition of that time, which we can glean from a number of elements in the Torah reading, as part of the tradition from that time, 3,700 years ago, and perhaps older, the father bestows a blessing upon the eldest of his children. Hopefully, the eldest is a male. Hopefully, not always the case, but hopefully. And in keeping with that convention, that tradition, that was already present and powerful at that time, old man Isaac is about to bless his eldest son, who is Esau. But Jacob inserts himself, masquerades as Esau, and purloins the blessing that is supposed to be designated for his elder twin. And when the elder twin Esau learns of this, he prepares to kill his younger twin brother. And so Jacob runs away and he goes back to Syria, which is where Jacob's mother came from. He goes back to the grandparents' land. So the reason that Jacob ends up going back to his mother's family's ancestral holdings, which is where he meets eventually his uncle, is because he's stolen something that you can't put a price on. It's an amorphous element. It's a blessing from a father to a child, but it doesn't really belong to him. It belongs to someone else. You can't put a value on that. But Jacob runs away because he's stolen something from his father and his brother. And he ends up encountering his uncle, and ultimately he works for his uncle for 20 years, marrying two cousins. They are his sisters, Rachel and Leah, and two other assistant handmaidens, you might say. And he has 4 wives, and now 11 sons and 1 daughter. And after 20 years of hard work, he's accumulated flock and herd and wealth, and he realizes that it's time to go back home. Perhaps being a father and a husband and a man of some means, he's learned things over 20 years. You can't run away, especially from your family. So he's preparing to go back to encounter his brother. And that's where we are here at this scene. And please allow me a few moments just to read verses 17 through 21 in Hebrew, because we need to remember what Torah sounds like. Even if we do not have a minyan in our building, we need to remember what Torah sounds like. Vayakum Yaakov vayisa et banav et nashav al agmalim vaynaeg et kol migneu et kol richusho asher rechash mikneh kinyano asher rechash befadan aram lavo el Yitzchak aviv artza Canaan v'lavan halach ligzoz et tzono vatignov Rachel tatrafim asher laviha vaignov Yaakov et lev Lavan arami al bli higilo kivrachu vayvrachu v'chol asher lo v'kom v'yavor et hanahar vayosam et panav har hagilad. And now I'd like to make a comment, and I want to touch on verse page 182, and it's verse number 19 and following. So Jacob runs away from his father-in-law, taking the 2 wives, the 2 handmaidens who were originally the father-in-law's property. They were domestic servants, and a great deal of cattle that he's accumulated over 20 years of serving as a shepherd, being paid in flock and herd. In verse number 19, For Lavan and Laban, the father-in-law, left to shear his sheep, which means he's on a business trip. He's at a conference. He's in Vegas somewhere. He's far away. And therefore, it's easy to sneak away. And we would say in English, it's easy to steal away. And I'm making a pun on purpose. Steal away. And Rachel stole some of her father's household idols as the family is packing the U-Haul, preparing to leave to go to Canaan. Jacob is from Canaan. Rachel and Leah have never been to Canaan, never seen any photographs. They have no idea where they're going. They're leaving Syria, traveling south to a brand new land, and we don't know why Rachel stole her father's household idols. Perhaps she wanted to have a strong keepsake or memento. More than nostalgia, maybe she needed a sense of the gods that she'd grown up with would protect her as she left Syria and went to Canaan. We don't know. But she stole her father's household idols. But you know if she stole them. Verse 20. And then it says something interesting. And Jacob stole, literally in Hebrew, he stole the heart of his father-in-law because he didn't tell him he was leaving. Now, again, Laban is off somewhere else, shearing the sheep, which was an important part of life. And evidently you gathered your sheep and your flocks and you went somewhere in a certain place. And you had a lot of people show up together and they all did this sheep shearing. And it was your payoff for a year of work. Breeding the cattle, and many animals died and some survived and they grew, and it was a payoff for a year's work, 2 years' work, 3 years' work, seasonal work, and you sheared your sheep. And then you actually had a big party because you could start guessing and estimating how much your income would be for the next at least a year, maybe 2, based upon the shearings that you would be selling at a marketplace somewhere. So going to shear sheep was a very important part of the ancient culture. We know this from a number of references in the early parts of Genesis. But while Laban is busy with a very important part of his life, and he's preoccupied, Jacob leaves. And I use the English, steals away. And interestingly, the Torah points out that, in a way, Jacob stole something of Laban. He stole his heart. And that might be a playoff of deceiving the father-in-law. And it may be as well that Jacob took Laban's 2 daughters and all the grandchildren. And Laban had no chance to say goodbye. That's stealing the heart. So I want you to see how the word stealing occurs, especially in this one little section. And remember that the reason Jacob is in Syria in the first place 20 years ago is that he stole something of his own father and his own brother, something intangible, a blessing. And now, if you look at page 183, Laban comes along and chases and catches up with Jacob. And on page 183, it's verse number 26, Jacob and Laban are there. I won't say that they're bosom buddy. And Laban says in verse number 26, "You stole my heart, you left early. Why'd you run away?" And he says it again in verse number 27, "You stole something from me. I would have sent you off with a party and celebration and music and had a grand farewell bash, but you stole something from me." And then in verse number 31, Jacob retorts, he uses the same word, in Hebrew it's the same word, it's gezel, which means stole. And Jacob says, "You know, you've taken property from me as well. And there have been times that I wanted certain cattle and certain payment, and you kept changing my wages. You stole something from me, and so I left." So Jacob justifies his own behavior. Maybe he's kind of patting himself on the back, or maybe he's trying to come up with some kind of rationale. Since you stole from me, father-in-law, I left sneakily while you were busy somewhere else. And it strikes me again and again that Torah, the core of our existence, begins with family and family conflict and tension and strife. And it does not try to conceal the faults of our ancestors. In fact, it's an open book to anyone who wishes to read and see. How are we, within our own family dynamics, to address conflict and struggle? How are we, children born of Abraham and Sarah, children of God, to address emotion and conflict and disagreement? How are we to bring holiness into our daily lives between people whom we love and frankly sometimes we can't stand, and they as well vis-a-vis us? I can't give you an answer to that. Each one of us must find the right answer with conscience, and hopefully that's a little bit of touch of God. I think we need to be honest as we struggle and grow and shape our identities. And thereafter, it's a really striking sentence. It's here on page number 186. Laban and Jacob finally come to some terms after a lot of arguing back and forth, and they agree that they will not be in conflict again. And unfortunately, you and I have witnessed families where conflict ensues and is maintained for years and years and years, and maybe even generations. Is that the legacy that we wish to transmit? Conflict between a grandfather to grandchildren and both sides of the relationship. And as Laban and Jacob come to that kind of an awareness that they can't continue to live in conflict, better to live apart than to have conflict, they make a deal. And they make a deal, it's called a treaty or a brit, a covenant, a bris, a covenant. And they make this deal that they will never come, he into his land, he into his land. They're going to just live apart, separate, but they're not going to be in conflict. And they sign the deal by verse 45, 46, and 47, the bottom of 185 to 186, by doing a little bit of schlep work. They gather stones and they bring them together and they pile them up in a pile. If we were in northern Scotland, we call them a cairn. This is a pile. Anybody walking along in the ancient days saw a pile, knew that something had happened there. Remember, they didn't have billboards back then. So it took effort to gather stones, small boulders, to assemble them into some kind of a column or a pile. And ever after, anybody walking along that road knew that something important happened at that point. Because a billboard just doesn't appear out of nowhere, especially a pile of stones. And so they gathered this pile of stones. They had a celebratory treaty sealing meal there. And then Laban returned to Syria, and Jacob headed on further south towards Israel. And what strikes me here, it's verse number 47. Pardon me. Laban named it Yagar Sahaduta, which means he's speaking Aramaic. Jacob named it Gal Ed. Jacob speaking Hebrew. What does this mean? Has Jacob not been speaking to his father-in-law for 20 years, living in Syria? Of course he has. Has Jacob learned Aramaic, which is the Syrian language? Of course he has. Why is Jacob calling this pile of stones a Hebrew word, as Laban calls it Aramaic and then heads home? And I would suggest that Jacob sees himself now as returning to, call it Israel, Judaic origins, identity as the grandson of Abraham, something along those lines. And he incorporates Hebrew into this billboard. And Laban has heard the word Galed, but recorded it in his diary as Yigar Saduta, Aramaic. These people are separating themselves culturally and linguistically, but also for the purposes of avoiding violence. Is that a lesson that we can incorporate into our lives today? And then the final thought, It's on page 187. It's chapter 32. Chapter 32. It's verse 4. Jacob went on his way, and angels of God met him. Jacob's coming back to Israel, and angels of God met him, and the word machaneh means camp, and so Jacob makes a play on words. Machanayim, it's like machaneh Elohim, the angel, the camp of God. Machaneh Elohim, camp of God. Machaneh Elohim becomes machanayim, play on words, Hebrew. Angels of God met Jacob. And then it stops, and there's no more mention of this ever again. And you and I are left with lots of questions. What does it mean for angels to show up and meet somebody on the door, on the roadway? How do we know? How did Jacob know that they're angels? Well, there's so many questions here. And it's striking to me that it's as if the Torah is satisfied to just drop this nugget here and allow you and me to discuss it and question it and be confused over it. What does it mean to encounter angels at the doorway or on the roadway? How do we know they were angels? It's presented here in a way of almost certainty and obviousness. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you and I, in moments of conflict and distress, separating from family, trying to avoid hostility, had a sense of certainty and reassurance that God's presence is with us? That's presented here for the sake of Jacob, you might say. Wouldn't it be wonderful if that were the case for us in our own lives? How do we aspire to such an experience that God is with us when we're trying to deal with stress and avoidance of hostility with family? Perhaps it's reaching inside. Perhaps it's opening our eyes and our mind to something outside of ourselves. We pause at this moment. We studied Torah, and now we offer a prayer of healing, and then just a moment or two of studying the Haftorah. But for now, Mishaberach, a prayer of healing for our family members and our friends. And we say, Mishaberach Avotenu Avim Zavotenu Sorov Karachav V'Leah Hivrek Rabhet Kol Cholim Elav Zekolel Et Carol Boys Yinta Bat Gisha Chana Sarba Peshalea, Elalea Bataviva, La Claudia Thomas, Monica Knight, George Barton, Mordechai Ben Zelda, George Patinos, Debbie Pfeiffer, Tom Bastoni, Avi Moshe Ben Mendochana, Chana Bat Meredith, Billy Singleton, Shri Singleton, Yaakov Ben Leora, Bruce Kahn, Rivka Bat Kayla, Amelia Rose Bat Amanda Jean, Tovalea Bat Freda, Shira Avot Bat Sarah, Avram Yehuda Ben Gisha, Bet De Palma, Robin Mayer, Spencer Bat Bashi, Mirma Bashi, Shira Bat Sarah, Reuven Ben Leah Chaya, Rivka Bat Chavshalivsha, Wendy Fastman, Anna Moat, David Shlomo Ben Tovanachum Uvinyamin, Monica Linton. Amen. Almighty God, as you have blessed our mothers and our fathers, bring forth healing, the loving touch of your grand power to all those who are mentioned in our mouths and kept in our hearts, for those who are ill, those who are afflicted, those who are weakened, those who are suffering. Extend your touch from the heavens to where each and every person is, and bring forth healing and renewed vitality and strength. Bring forth your care, the care which fashioned the heavens, the care which brought our ancestors across mountains and seas and deserts, to each and every person known to you and remembered with our love. Favor them with your presence, and station your angels of healing and power by their sides. Lift them up. Assist them to walk forward into a new future, a future marked by hope and optimism, not marked by anxiety, fear, distress, and worry. Lessen the suffering and the sorrow and increase the sense of optimism and hope and satisfaction. Hear this prayer this day and many more every day in the years ahead. May these days and years be years of blessing and peace. And we all say, Amen. And now a thought for Haftorah, and then we shall conclude the service. The Haftorah is found here on page 188, in the Chumash. And if you have a Tanakh at home, it's the book of Hosea, chapter 12. Just skimming through a few verses of Hosea. Hosea lived 2,700 years ago. He would not have known lox from bagel or a Goldberg from a Kaplan. He lived 2,700 years ago. And his understanding of Jewish life was very different than yours and mine. His understanding was keeping Jewish people apart from pagans and doing everything he could to have them hold fast to a belief in the invisible God, the power beyond all things. So here on page 189, we have a few plays on words. First, chapter 12, verse number 13. Jacob had to flee to the land of Aram, that's Syria. There Israel served her wife. Jacob and Israel are the same person. And of course, that's the reference to the Torah reading here. Our ancestor Jacob ran away because his brother was going to kill him. And he went to Syria and he ended up marrying ultimately 2 women and then 2 more for a total of 4. But that's the poetry. So Jacob and Israel ran away. And then chapter 13. When Ephraim is a code word for Israel again. Ephraim is one of Jacob's 12 sons. So that means Ephraim is a code word for Jacob, Israel, but also the flourishing and the growing of the family, hopefully in health and safety and longevity and lineage and generation. So it's a sense of promise. When Ephraim spoke piety, he was exalted in the land of Israel. That means when Ephraim did what he was supposed to as an Israelite, a monotheist, everything is good. But he incurred guilt through Baal, and so he died. And at the time that Hosea was living 2,700 years ago, Baal, Canaanitic idol worship, was rife. And Hosea can't tolerate Jews bowing down to idols named Baal. And so that's what he's complaining about here. And verse number 2, it's the last line of verse number 2. They are inclined to kiss calves. That should remind you of the golden calf episode, which is a really bad thing. So that means that by the time of Hosea 2,700 years ago, there have been Israelites up and down for 600 years worshiping calves and statues, which is a really bad thing. So now, turn to page 191. Just skimming, verse number 12, here's this Ephraim again. Ephraim's guilt is bound up. Ephraim is guilty because those Israelites, when they bow down to statues, they're doing the wrong thing. Chapter 14, Samaria, that's another nickname for the community of Israel. Samaria must bear her guilt, for she has defied her God. And that brings to mind a core element in Jewish tradition. We are responsible for our behavior. I'm responsible for mine, you're responsible for yours. I'm not responsible for your behavior, and you're not responsible for mine, other than encouraging us to do the right thing within our own relationships. Samaria must bear her guilt. And look at verse number 2 of chapter 14. Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God. You have fallen because of your sin. That should sound familiar, and indeed, that element comes into what we call the Yom Kippur prayer service. Return, Israel. Do things that are better. And now here, look at page 192. This is a quick summary. Again, this is a Hosea piece, 2,700 years ago. Verse number 9, Ephraim, that's the Jewish people, shall say, what more have I to do with idols? Rhetorical question. What? I'm not going to believe in idols anymore. When I respond and look to him, capitalized H, I'm thinking about God. I become like a verdant cypress. When I think about God, I become as beautiful as a tree. I become as fulfilled as a beautiful part of life itself. So here there's a kind of a short summary of, I realize that I've done wrong, and I need to turn myself back to a wholeness of a relationship with the one true God, Adonai Elohim. And it's couched in poetry because that, I think, was how Hosea spoke to our ancestors 2,700 years ago. We rise, turning in the Siddur, to a prayer for our nation and a prayer for Israel, and then we shall lift the Torah. In the Siddur, a prayer for our nation on page 177 on the English side. The bottommost stanza of the English on page 177. May it be your will that our land be a blessing to all who dwell on earth, and may you cause all peoples to dwell in friendship and freedom. Speedily fulfill the vision of your prophets. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. For all of them, from the least of them to the greatest, shall know me. And let us say, Amen. And on page 178, the first line of Hebrew, followed by the English prayer for Israel. Avinu Shabashamayim, Tzur Yisrael v'go'alo, Barech et Medinat Yisrael, Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu. Avinu Shabashamayim, stronghold and redeemer of the people Israel. Bless the state of Israel, the beginning of our redemption. Shield it with your love. Spread over it the shelter of your peace. Guide its leaders and advisors with your light and your truth. Help them with your good counsel. Strengthen the hands of those who defend our holy land. Deliver them. Crown their efforts with triumph. Bless the land with peace and its inhabitants with lasting joy. And let us say, Amen. And now Hagba and Galila, Gadiel. Okay. Devorah, will you come up to address the Torah? V'zot ha'Torah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael al pi Adonai b'yad Moshe. Dundai, 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 dai, dundai, 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 dai, dundai, 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 dai, dundai, 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 dai. Eretz Yisrael b'li Torah, hikeguf b'li neshama. Eretz Yisrael b'li Torah, hikeguf b'li neshama. Dundai, 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 dai, dundai, 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 dai. Dundai, 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 dai, dundai, 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 dai. Eretz Yisrael b'li Torah, hikeguf b'li neshama. Eretz Yisrael b'li Torah, hikeguf b'li neshama. Dundai, 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 dai, dundai, 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 dai, dundai, 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 dai, dundai, 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 dai. And now on page 184, returning the Torah to the Aron, page 184, it's the top stanza of the page, and it's the last three lines, Eitz Chaim. Eitz Chaim hi lemachazikim ba v'tom Shomcheha Meushar Deracheha Darchei Noam Bechol Netivoteha Shalom Hashivenu Adonai Elecha V'nashuva Chadesh Chadesh Yameinu Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. Shkoyach Adonai Shamash. We remain standing pages 204 and 205. Page 204. En Keloheinu, en Kadonenu, en Kemalkeinu, en Kemoshienu, Micheloheinu, Michadonenu, Michemalkeinu, Michmoshienu, Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adonenu, Nodel Emalkeinu, Nodel Moshienu, Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu, Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adonenu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu, Atahu Sheketiru, Avotenu, Lefanecha et Ktoret Hasamim. The Olenu on page 205. Aleinu leshabeach la'adon hakol latet gedula leotzer breshit shelo asanu kgoye haratzot velo samanu kimishpachot adama shelo sam chelkenu kahem vegor aleinu kechol hamonam vanachnu korim umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu shehu noteh shamayim v'yosed haaretz umoshav yikaro b'shamayim mima'al ushchinat uzo begovei meromim hu Eloheinu ein od Emet Malkeinu, Eves Zulato, Kakatu Betorato, Vyadata Yom, Vahashevota, Elavavecha, Ki Adonai, Hua Elohim, Bashamayim Mimal, Vial Haaretz, Mitachot, Einod. The end of page 206. Kakatu b'toratecha, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, v'ne'emar v'haya Adonai le'melech al kol haaretz, bayom hahu, yihyeh Adonai echad, Ushemol echad. In a moment, the Mourner's Kaddish in our Siddur on page 207, and those perhaps joining in at home are invited to remain standing if they're saying Kaddish as well. And it is our practice to mention the names of our loved ones. And as a synagogue, we remember those who've died during this week, marked in the Hebrew calendar, remembering with love Anna Muchnick Sates, Jacob Mazel, Rose Ratner, Ida Rubin, Mashi Weinstein, Emmanuel Liebeskind, Rose Zuckerman, Harold Mazel, Lena Katz, Claude Petty, Linda Hamlich Malchute, B'chaye Chon Uviyome Chon Uvachaye Dechol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala Uvizman Kariv V'imeru. Amen. Yehi Shmei Rabo Mivarach Le'olam Olalmei Olmaya. Yitbarach V'yishtabach V'yitpa'ar V'yitramam V'yitnaseh. V'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei dekudesha b'richu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechamata da'amiran ba'olma v'miru. Amen. Yehei shalama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imeru. Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imeru. Amen. There's nothing within the Kaddish itself that speaks of mourning. I think it's Mourner's Kaddish because of the placement of the prayer in the service. In a minute, we'll say the Kiddush with the wine or grape juice and the Hamotzi, and we'll sing Adon Olam, but the Kaddish is really the last main prayer of the service. Which means what? The Kaddish is what people say and hear as they're about to leave the building. So the last prayer that we hear and interact with is noticing who's standing. And that means as you and I are walking out of the building, we have an opportunity to walk past somebody or to stop and ask, why are you saying Kaddish? It's the position in the service that's the significance here. It reminds us that we need to stop and pause and look and see who is saying Kaddish and find out why. And it's that gesture of care and concern that demarcates this prayer specifically for mourners, so that just before we leave the building, we stop and pay attention to someone. And then we're able to walk and continue on our way. We need to pay attention to each other. That's one of the important elements of Jewish prayer, paying attention to each other in moments of joy, in moments of sorrow. When we do that, then we have prayed. Our hearts go out to all those who are mourning and all who are grieving. And while we unfortunately are separated because of this pandemic, you're still in our thoughts, you're still in our hearts, and we care for you deeply. A couple of announcements, and then we'll have the Adon Olam and Kiddush and Hamotzi. Adon Olam will be on page 211. Reminders, as we're turning to Adon Olam on page 211. Tonight, Havdalah is on Zoom at 7 p.m. Monday, Tanakh study is on Zoom at noon. Tuesday, Adult Hebrew is on Zoom at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And Tuesday, Spirit discussion on Zoom. Tuesday, Spirit discussion at 5. The topic is, does Judaism endorse competition? That's the topic for the Spirit discussion on Tuesday. And Thursday, November 18th, is the launch of the Jewish Mobile Oral History Project. Woohoo! We're very excited. Deborah Gert has been working on this for quite some time, and it's part of the Doy Leal McCall Archive, which is housed at the Marks Library on campus. And there will be ongoing, still wrapping up a little bit of interviews of Jewish people to help us get a feel for what it means to be Jewish in Mobile and as Mobilians. And this material will be available for researchers for years to come. So the kickoff, you might say, is at Tuesday the 18th at 4 o'clock in the USA Marks Library, and there's a guest speaker from the Institute of Southern Jewish Life, and there'll be refreshments, and so we hope people can join in, and later on this material will be available online. And next Friday is the Guitar Shabbat with Yehuda, normal time 6 to 7. With that, we'll turn to the Adon Olam, and then a chance to make Kiddush and Motzi, and perhaps those at home will join in with Kiddush and Motzi as well, with wine or grape juice and bread in your own homes. Adon Olam Hashem Malach B'terem Kol Yetzir Nivra Li'etz Nasa V'chefza Kol Azai Melech Shemo Nikra Azai Melech Shemo Nikra V'yacharei Kichlot HaKol Levado Yimloch Nora V'hu Haya V'hu Hoveh V'hu Yiyeh B'ti Tifara, v'hu yeh b'tifara, v'hu echad v'yein sheni, laham shilo, lahakbira, b'li reshit, b'li tachlit, v'lo ha'oz v'ha'misra, v'lo ha'oz v'ha'misra, v'hu eli, v'chai go'ali, v'tzur chevli, b'yeit tzara, v'hu nisi umanosli, Menat kosi biyom ekra, menat kosi biyom ekra, biyado avkid ruchi ba'et isham v'yaira v'im ruchi gaviyati Adonai li v'lo ira, Adonai li v'lo ira. Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos, and we'll be making Kiddush in a moment. And we have some here in our shul who are going to be stepping back to the table at the rear of the sanctuary to pour a glass of wine or juice and to gather up a piece of bread. And as I said, perhaps you at home are joining in with us with a glass of wine or grape juice and also a bit of challah. And so we'll begin. Kiddush means sanctification. It's the act of making something holy. We don't make wine holy. That's the other guys. We don't make grape juice holy. That's the other guys. We don't make anything holy. God makes things holy. When you and I are in the right frame of mind, we declare that something is holy because we're interacting with God. We're interacting with the world. We're interacting with each other. So it's a declaration that time can be sacred. That's Kiddush. That time can be sacred. V'shamru.
V'shamru v'nei Yisrael.
Et ha-Shabbat, la'asot et ha-Shabbat, l'dorotam brit olam, beini uvein b'nei Yisrael, oti li'olam, ki sheshet yamim asa Adonai, et ha-shamayim v'et haaretz, uvayom hashvi, Shabbat v'inafash. Al-Kain Beirach Adonai Yom HaShabbat B'Kadsheu. Therefore, God blessed the seventh day, made it holy, and we can make time as well holy. Savrei Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Olam Borei Peri HaGofen. You want to wash? Baruch atah Adonai melech haolam asher k'dam b'tzivanu al netilat yadayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Thank you for joining in. Shabbat Shalom. Litrot, until we see each other again, hopefully in person, may you know that you are a source of blessing. God loves you, and we do as well. Until we see each other, Shabbat Shalom.